The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. The quiet hum of machines filled the hospital room like a haunting rhythm, the only sound breaking the silence that had settled over Noah's bedside. The storm that had raged over Los Angeles for days had finally subsided, but the tension in the air remained thick, as if nature itself refused to rest until justice was served. Noah's condition had been the center of relentless anxiety for his family. Every hour that passed without movement deepened the ache in their hearts, and every whispered conversation outside his door was heavy with fear that he might never wake up. But across the ocean of worry and grief, one man had already decided this would not be the end. Victor Newman had left Genoa City the moment he received the call. His grandson had been attacked, and that was something he would never forgive. When Victor arrived in Los Angeles, the very atmosphere seemed to shift. His presence carried a weight that silenced rooms. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, a patriarch who built empires, destroyed enemies, and protected his family with an almost divine ferocity. To see his grandson lying helpless in a hospital bed reignited a fire inside him that had been dormant for too long. The sight of Noah, pale and unmoving beneath the sterile lights, struck Victor harder than he cared to admit. It wasn't just pain, it was rage, the kind of fury that simmered behind the eyes of a man who had spent decades learning how to weaponize silence. Sharon stood near the window, her arms crossed tightly, eyes red from sleepless nights. Nick was by her side, looking as though he carried the weight of the entire Newman legacy on his shoulders. When Victor entered, neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The air shifted, the balance of the room changed. The patriarch had arrived, and with him came the promise of retribution. His first words were quiet but cut like glass, a warning disguised as reassurance. He reminded them that the Newman name had survived every storm, every scandal, every betrayal, and this time would be no different. But beneath his calm tone was an unmistakable threat. Someone had hurt his blood, and that someone would pay dearly. Victor's investigation began before Noah even opened his eyes. He spoke to doctors, demanded updates from the police, and ordered private security to monitor every entrance of the hospital. "No one comes near him," he told them, "unless I say so." There was no room for negotiation. He knew too well how enemies operated, they waited for weakness, for hesitation. And the Newman family could not afford either. He warned Nick and Sharon that whoever had orchestrated this attack might not be finished, that this was more than an isolated act of violence. "Protect him," he ordered. "Day and night. Because if that man comes back to finish what he started, I will not forgive anyone who let it happen." His voice carried the weight of command, and even Nick, who often bristled under his father's authority, said nothing this time. They all understood what was at stake. Days passed, and the tension only grew thicker. The doctors spoke of uncertainty, Noah's injuries were severe, and while there were signs of brain trauma, it was too soon to predict whether he would recover fully. Each test result felt like a cruel game of hope and despair. Sharon refused to leave his side, holding his hand as if her presence alone could pull him back to consciousness. Nick stood watch like a soldier guarding sacred ground. And then, just as the sun began to rise one quiet morning, something changed. The monitors that had beeped steadily for days began to fluctuate, and Noah's fingers twitched faintly against Sharon's hand. The nurse on duty called for the doctor, but by the time they arrived, Noah's eyelids fluttered open. The room fell silent. It was as if time itself had stopped. Sharon gasped, tears spilling down her face. Nick's hand tightened on the bedrail. And when Victor stepped forward, his expression softened for just a moment, the briefest crack in the armor of a man known for control. Noah blinked several times, his vision blurred, his breathing uneven. The doctors rushed in, shining lights into his eyes, speaking words he couldn't yet comprehend. "He's awake," one of them said, disbelief mixed with relief. "He's responsive, but weak. We need to run tests." The word awake echoed like a prayer through the corridors. But as Noah struggled to speak, the doctor warned them that there might be complications. The blow to his head had caused potential memory loss, and it was unclear how much he remembered. Sharon froze. Nick's heart sank. Victor's face remained unreadable, though his jaw clenched tightly. The possibility that Noah might not recall what had happened, or worse, who had done this, was almost unbearable. But when Noah turned his head weakly toward his grandfather, something in his eyes flickered, a trace of recognition, faint but real. "Grandpa," he whispered hoarsely. The single word broke the dam of emotion in the room. Sharon sobbed openly, gripping his hand. Nick exhaled for the first time in hours. And Victor, for all his stoicism, felt a weight lift from his chest. He leaned closer, placing a hand on Noah's shoulder, his voice low but steady. "I'm here, my boy," he said. "You're safe now." But Victor was not there for comfort alone. His mind was already calculating, assessing. Every second mattered now, not just to ensure Noah's recovery, but to uncover the truth behind the attack. When the doctor finally cleared them for a brief conversation, Victor wasted no time. He needed answers. He leaned closer, his sharp eyes fixed on his grandson's face. "Noah," he said slowly, "who did this to you? Who hurt you?" Sharon protested, saying it was too soon, that Noah needed rest, but Victor ignored her. He had waited long enough. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of medical machines. Noah's lips parted, his voice trembling, and for a moment, Victor feared he might not remember anything. But then Noah's expression changed, a flicker of fear, followed by anger. His eyes filled with tears, and he whispered a name that made Victor's blood run cold. "Mitch." The sound of that name shattered the calm like glass breaking under pressure. Sharon gasped. Nick's expression twisted into disbelief. But Victor froze, every instinct sharpening at once. He had heard that name before, spoken in darker circles, whispered in connection with violence and corruption. Mitch, the same man who had recently surfaced in Los Angeles, the one tied to a web of deceit that had been quietly spreading through the city's underworld. But this revelation carried another layer of horror. Mitch wasn't just another criminal, he was Sienna's husband, the same Sienna who had already entangled herself in the lives of the Newmans through her manipulations and ambition. For a moment, Victor said nothing. His hand tightened on the edge of the bed, the muscles in his jaw twitching. The implications were enormous. If Mitch had targeted Noah, it wasn't random. This was personal. Victor's mind raced through the possibilities. Had Sienna known? Was this an act of revenge, or part of something larger? The questions burned through him, feeding the anger that had been simmering since he first saw Noah lying unconscious. Sharon began to cry again, murmuring that it couldn't be true, that there had to be some mistake. But Victor knew better. In his world, coincidences did not exist. He stood up straight, his eyes cold and focused, the expression of a man already plotting the next move. "Then it ends now," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. From that moment, Victor's mission was clear. The attack on Noah was not just a crime, it was a declaration of war. Mitch had crossed a line that no one crossed and lived to tell about. Victor's anger was not loud, it was precise, controlled, lethal. He ordered his men to begin gathering everything they could on Mitch Bacall, financial records, associates, known locations. He wanted the man found, but not arrested. Victor Newman didn't believe in letting others handle his family's justice. He believed in sending messages, the kind that no one ever forgot. As Noah slowly regained fragments of memory over the next few days, pieces of the puzzle began to surface. He remembered the confrontation, a meeting that had gone wrong, a warning ignored. Mitch had approached him under false pretenses, pretending to offer help with a charity project. But beneath the surface, there had been threats, demands, something about paying for Sienna's humiliation. It all blurred together, but the fear in Noah's eyes when he recalled those moments confirmed everything Victor needed to know. The attack had been calculated. Mitch had wanted revenge. And now, he had made himself the target of the most dangerous man in Genoa City. Victor's plane was ready by dawn. Los Angeles might have been a playground for chaos, but he was about to remind everyone that the Newmans still ruled their world with power and precision. Before leaving the hospital, he stood at Noah's bedside one last time. His grandson was resting again, fragile but alive. Sharon whispered that they should let the authorities handle it, but Victor simply gave her a look, the kind that ended arguments before they began. "I will handle it," he said softly. "And I will make sure he never touches this family again." Outside, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds. Victor put on his coat, his expression unreadable. But beneath that calm surface was a storm far deadlier than the one that had raged over the city. The world had just learned, once again, what it meant to cross the Newmans. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Mitch Bacall, husband of Sienna, enemy of the family, had no idea that his time was already running out. Because when Victor Newman vowed vengeance, it was never an empty promise. It was a sentence. And this time, nothing and no one would stand in his way. Victor's expression barely changed when Noah whispered the name. It wasn't surprise that crossed his face, it was recognition. For years, the name Mitch Bacall had hovered on the edges of his business dealings, a shadow figure whispered about in closed circles, a man whose influence operated in the gray spaces between legality and crime. Victor had never dealt with him directly, but he had encountered his kind before, men who mistook fear for power, who thought they could manipulate others into submission without consequence. Mitch had once been tied to a failed corporate acquisition that threatened Newman Enterprises nearly a decade ago, a hostile maneuver that Victor had dismantled with quiet efficiency before it ever reached the press. He remembered the name attached to shell companies, offshore accounts, and a failed attempt to extort one of his associates. Mitch had disappeared soon after, reportedly fleeing to Europe. Now, to hear that same man's name tied to the attack on his grandson reignited an old fire in Victor's chest. He wasn't surprised, he was reminded. The kind of men who crossed his path always resurfaced eventually. They always made the same mistake, forgetting who he was. The hospital room grew quiet again as the reality sank in. Noah's breathing steadied, though his body was still weak from the trauma. Sharon sat beside him, stroking his hair with trembling hands, her relief mixed with exhaustion. Nick stood near the window, watching the city lights flicker beyond the glass. He looked older in that moment, burdened not by age but by the relentless pressure of carrying a family name that demanded strength even in grief. Victor stood apart, his gaze distant but sharp, lost in thought as he pieced together the puzzle that had just been handed to him. Mitch's involvement wasn't just an act of revenge, it was a message. Someone had dared to challenge the Newmans on their own ground, using violence as leverage. But Victor wasn't a man who responded to threats with fear. He responded with precision. When Victor finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried the weight of command. "You don't worry about him," he said, turning to Noah. "I'll find him. I'll make sure he never hurts this family again." The words weren't a promise, they were a sentence. Noah tried to speak again, but Victor placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to rest. "You've done enough, my boy. Leave the rest to me." There was something almost biblical in the way he said it, as though vengeance was not just an act of anger, but a sacred duty. Sharon wanted to protest, to remind him that the police were already investigating, but she knew better. When Victor made up his mind, nothing could stop him. The authorities might handle justice in their own time, but Victor's justice was swifter, colder, and final. As he stepped out into the hallway, his mind was already racing ahead. Mitch wouldn't be easy to find, not because he was clever, but because men like him were cowards who hid behind intermediaries and paid loyalty. But Victor had one advantage that Mitch had underestimated: Sienna. The connection between them was the weak point. Sienna's reputation in Los Angeles had always been volatile, a mixture of charm and ambition that left chaos in her wake. She had inserted herself into business circles with calculated grace, always keeping powerful men within her orbit. Victor had observed her from afar once, at a corporate event years ago, and had immediately recognized the dangerous intelligence in her eyes. She was not someone who played small games. But now, she was vulnerable. Her husband had crossed the wrong man, and that made her the key. Victor ordered his security chief to begin tracking Sienna's movements. Within hours, they had a list of her known addresses, her favorite meeting spots, and the people she trusted, or thought she did. He didn't plan to storm in guns blazing, that wasn't his style. He believed in the quiet power of control, in the art of making people come to him. If he could reach Sienna first, he knew he could use her fear, her pride, her fractured loyalties to draw Mitch out of hiding. It was simple psychology, something Victor had mastered over decades of battles both corporate and personal. He didn't need to threaten her. He only needed to remind her what it meant to face him. Back inside the hospital room, Sharon and Nick finally allowed themselves to breathe. For days, they had lived on the edge of collapse, sustained only by the hope that Noah would wake up. Now that he had, the exhaustion hit them all at once. Nick pulled Sharon into his arms, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tears came quietly, the kind that don't need words because the emotion is too deep to articulate. Sharon buried her face against his chest, whispering prayers of gratitude between sobs. Nick held her tighter, feeling the familiar ache of both relief and guilt. They had nearly lost their son, and though the danger wasn't entirely over, they believed Victor's arrival had changed everything. When Victor took control, things got done. No one crossed the Newmans and walked away unscathed. For the first time in weeks, Nick felt that they could finally rest, if only for a moment. The following day, Victor met with one of his longtime informants in Los Angeles, a man who owed him more favors than he could count. They met in a quiet cafe downtown, away from the polished boardrooms and luxury offices where Victor usually conducted business. He preferred places like this for matters of retribution. Unremarkable, forgettable, easy to vanish from. The informant was nervous, shifting in his seat as Victor arrived. He knew who he was dealing with. Victor didn't need to raise his voice, his mere presence was enough to make men confess their sins. "I need to know everything about Mitch Bacall," he said evenly. "Where he's hiding, who's protecting him, and what he wants with my family." Within an hour, Victor had everything he needed. Mitch had been operating from the outskirts of the city, moving money through shell corporations and meeting with dangerous associates. But the most interesting detail wasn't about Mitch himself, it was about Sienna. She had been seen recently meeting with investors tied to Mitch's criminal network. Some said she was trying to clean up his mess, others claimed she was complicit. Victor didn't care which was true. Both would lead him to the same conclusion. He knew that people like Sienna didn't operate out of loyalty, they operated out of self-preservation. If he could corner her, she would betray Mitch in a heartbeat. And once Mitch was exposed, Victor would ensure he paid for what he did to Noah. That night, Victor stood by the window of his hotel suite overlooking Los Angeles. The city lights shimmered like scattered jewels, beautiful and deceptive, hiding its darkness beneath layers of glamour. He thought of all the years he had spent building power, protecting his family, and how, despite it all, danger always found its way back to them. But this was different. This wasn't a corporate rival or a jealous ex-employee. This was personal. He could still see Noah's pale face in that hospital bed, the faint tremor in his voice as he said Mitch's name. It replayed in his mind like a broken record. He knew he wouldn't sleep until it ended. By dawn, his plan was in motion. His men had already located Sienna's residence in West Hollywood. She was known for her late-night habits, her constant appearances at exclusive gatherings, and her tendency to surround herself with people who made her feel powerful. Victor decided he wouldn't approach her at home. Instead, he would make his move in a public place where her composure would falter under pressure. When the time came, she would have nowhere to hide. Back in Genoa City, word of Noah's recovery spread quickly, bringing a wave of relief to those who had feared the worst. For the Newmans, it was a reminder that their resilience was unmatched. Sharon and Nick stayed close to their son, vowing not to let him out of their sight again. Sharon often found herself watching Victor from afar, torn between admiration and unease. She knew that when Victor said he would handle something, he meant it. But she also knew what that meant for whoever stood on the other side. Mitch had made the mistake of touching the one thing Victor loved more than power, his family. And for that, there would be no mercy. That evening, Nick and Sharon sat together in the hospital lounge. The lights were dim, the air heavy with the kind of quiet that comes only after chaos. Nick wrapped an arm around Sharon's shoulders as she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "He's safe now," Nick whispered, though part of him knew safety was a fragile illusion when it came to their family. Sharon nodded through her tears, whispering that she just wanted things to go back to normal. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to believe that the worst was behind them. They didn't see the storm that was still gathering beyond the horizon, the one that Victor was already preparing to unleash. Because while the rest of the Newman family tried to heal, Victor had no intention of resting. He wasn't a man who waited for fate to deliver justice. He created it. And somewhere in the shimmering heart of Los Angeles, Sienna Bacall was about to learn that when Victor Newman set his sights on you, there was no place left to hide.